Wise saving banks required redefining failure itself. For generations, failure meant collapse. A bank failed, and the system absorbed the damage. Painful, visible, but contained. Then Europe chose a different path. To understand why this still matters today, we need to revisit a quiet shift, because the decision was not just about rescue. It was about redefining what failure even meant in modern banking. As crises grew more complex, old tools felt dangerous, allowing large banks to fail outright risk contagion. Interconnections turned collapse into catastrophe. The cost felt too high. Europe searched for an alternative, one that preserved discipline without triggering panic, one that allowed institutions to fail without letting the system follow. This search produced a new idea. Failure could be managed, losses could be allocated, continuity could be preserved. Resolution frameworks emerged. Living wills were written. Bail-in tools were designed to replace bailouts. On paper, this was a breakthrough. Shareholders would absorb losses. Creditors would bear responsibility. Taxpayers would be shielded. Banks adjusted accordingly. Capital structures changed. Loss-absorbing instruments expanded. Failure was planned for in advance. This planning created confidence. Markets believed collapse was less likely. Authorities believed control was restored. But redefining failure carries consequences. Because when failure no longer looks like collapse, its meaning begins to shift. The system was safer, but it was also different. And the true cost of this change would only become clear under stress. As the new definition took hold, expectations changed. Failure became procedural, predictable, contained within frameworks. Markets adjusted their assumptions. Risk was priced differently. The fear disorder receded. Confidence leaned on process rather than panic. Banks responded by restructuring liabilities. They issued instruments designed to absorb loss. They layered capital carefully. Resolvability became a strategic objective. Regulators reinforced this shift. Resolution plans were tested. Authorities coordinated across borders. Failure scenarios were rehearsed, not feared. This reduced uncertainty, but it also altered behavior. If failure could be managed, its threat felt less immediate. Investors distinguished between collapse and resolution. They focused on outcomes, not events. Losses were expected but controlled. This blurred an old boundary. A bank could fail without stopping operations, without freezing payments, without alarming depositors. The system gained continuity, but it also gained complexity. Understanding risk now required understanding rules, hierarchies, and timing. When stress appeared, questions changed. Not will this bank fail, but how will failure be executed? Who absorbs losses? Who remains protected? Confidence rested on belief in the framework, that authorities would act decisively, that coordination would hold, that plans would work under pressure. Failure had been redefined, but it had also been bureaucratized. And bureaucracy behaves differently when theory meets reality. The conflict emerged when theory met hesitation. Because frameworks assume clarity, crises rarely provided. When pressure intensified, decisions slowed. Authorities weighed consequences. Markets searched for signals. Uncertainty returned despite preparation. Resolution plans were detailed, but reality was messier. Cross-border coordination proved complex. Legal boundaries reappeared under stress. Investors reacted to ambiguity. Pricing shifted. Confidence thinned. The promise of orderly failure faced its first real tests. Banks felt the strain. Loss-absorbing instruments behaved unpredictably. Funding costs rose. Contagion fears resurfaced through new channels. This exposed attention at the heart of the system. Orderly failure required decisiveness. Decisiveness required political alignment. Alignment was not guaranteed under pressure. Authorities acted carefully. They emphasized stability. They delayed hard triggers. They balanced discipline with calm. This caution was understandable, but it diluted the message. If failure is planned, but never executed cleanly, belief weakens. Markets began to question outcomes. Would losses truly be imposed? Would support arrive again? Would failure remain controlled? The system held, but uncertainty lingered. The redefinition of failure had reduced panic, yet introduced doubt of a different kind. Failure was no longer feared. It was debated, and debate in moments of stress can be just as destabilizing. The climax arrived with a realization. Redefining failure does not eliminate risk. It redistributes it. Europe's resolution framework changed outcomes. Collapse became less likely. Continuity improved. Taxpayers were better protected. But clarity was not guaranteed. Execution depended on confidence, coordination, and speed. The system learned that failure must be credible. Plans must be usable. Losses must be imposed when promised. Without that, discipline erodes. Belief weakens. Risk-taking adapts. Authorities refine their approach. They clarified triggers. They strengthened cross-border coordination. They emphasized credibility through communication. Banks adjusted again. They simplified structures. They prepared for real loss allocation. They recognized that planning failure does not remove its consequences. Today, Europe's banks operate in this reality. Failure is possible, but it is managed, predictable, yet still painful. This balance matters because shielding the system entirely creates complacency. Allowing chaos creates panic. Resilience lies between the two. In a system where failure is survivable, but not painless, understanding this matters now, because the next stress will test not just balance sheets, but the credibility of failure itself. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The redefinition of failure also changed the relationship between a bank and its creditors in ways that are still being worked out. Before resolution frameworks existed, creditors of a failing bank faced a relatively simple situation. The bank failed, assets were liquidated, creditors received whatever the liquidation produced. The process was disorderly, but the principle was clear. You lent money to an institution that could not repay it. The loss is yours. Resolution frameworks introduced something more complicated. A bank could now fail while continuing to operate. Losses could be imposed on certain creditors, while other creditors, depositors, and critical functions were protected. The process was designed to be orderly. The principle was more nuanced. Your loss is calculated according to a hierarchy, determined by the type of instrument you hold, implemented according to a plan designed in advance, in a sequence supervised by a resolution authority. This is more rational than liquidation in important ways. It preserves value. It maintains critical services. It avoids the collateral damage that comes from sudden, complete closure, but it is also more complex. And complexity, in moments of stress, creates uncertainty. When a bank enters resolution, creditors must quickly assess whether they are unprotected or the bailed-in layer, whether the resolution authority will execute the plan as designed, whether the political will to impose losses on creditors will hold. Even if those creditors are pension funds, other banks, or large institutional investors. That uncertainty is not eliminated by having a framework. It is managed by the credibility of the framework. And credibility is something that frameworks must earn through execution, not announced through design. Europe's resolution framework has been partially executed. It has been tested in some cases, avoided in others. The cases where it was avoided tended to involve institutions large enough or politically connected enough that the full application of the framework felt too risky. Those avoidances weakened credibility. They sent a signal that the framework applies to some institutions, but not to others. That is a dangerous signal in a system where the value of the framework depends entirely on market participants believing it will be applied consistently. Europe has worked to address this, not always successfully, but with awareness that credibility requires consistency. And that consistency sometimes means imposing losses on creditors. In situations where absorbing those losses instead would be politically easier, that willingness to absorb political discomfort in service of long-term credibility is what separates a framework that works from one that merely exists. Europe has that willingness sometimes. It does not always have it. And the next major test of the resolution framework will depend heavily on whether the authorities who administer it retain enough institutional independence and political backing to apply it as designed. even when applying it is hard. That is not a legal question. It is a governance question. And governance questions are always about whether the people inside the system believe in the system enough to bear its costs. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. Why?